So we're delighted to be here today and to have the opportunity to talk to you about two model governance tools we've developed, both of which have a procurement component. And I'm going to start with a whole lot of disclaimers because I'm a lawyer. We are not at ELI procurement experts. We focus on our backgrounds, as you could hear. We're environmental lawyers and policy analysts, but we've been realizing more and more that climate change and other sustainability challenges just require a lot more in the way of interdisciplinary approaches and sort of a broader lens in terms of how to address these, in some cases, existential threats like climate change. And procurement in particular is just an incredibly important part of the solution. So I'm just going to stipulate that I'm quite sure many of you, especially based on that, really, that was a great presentation. I mean, just packed with content. I want to sort of spend a little more time with some of those slides. But I'm quite confident that many of you know more about procurement than we do. But what we are trying to do is to flag for people that there's an opportunity to advance, particular issues through procurement. So if Okay, Sarah's already ahead of me. So with that said, from a policy perspective, we've identified two important municipal sustainability topics. These are just two among others that we work on. But these are two that we hope cities will focus on more: advancing plant-based proteins and increasing the use of compost. And again, procurement is a tool in both cases. So go to the next slide. And again, this is just the general landscape. And we include this kind of background material and discussion with all of our resources, whether it's a toolkit or a model law or model policy, in order to set the stage. Because a lot of our work is aimed at building the capacity or the ability of smaller and mid-sized cities to take action on climate change. So we often want to provide some basic background information in case the city doesn't have a large staff and deep resources. So we include these background points on procurement, but in addition to on other issues. And again, I'm sure these points are very familiar to this group, but I wanted to share and just highlight a couple. One of them is just that governance structures and approaches vary from city to city, not just the form of government, mayor, council, or council city manager, and other factors, as Alyssa and I were mentioning, in terms of home rule authorities and other sort of macro issues, but they also vary with respect to procurement in particular. And that can just vary from city to city. Some municipalities are going to have an appointed procurement board that plays a significant role in procurement decision-making, for example. So cities are really dealing with varying governance landscapes when it comes to procurement. And then the other point that we always try to make is that, as we know in this group, local governments can use their procurement authority to achieve public policy perspectives in the literature. It can be referred to as collateral policies or secondary or complementary policies, horizontal policies, dual use policies. Academics and lawyers like to come up with a lot of words for things. But we just basically want people who are using our resources to understand that this is becoming more and more commonplace. And as Alyssa and I were discussing, we are going to take a much closer look at state procurement, but we have focused mainly on municipal level procurement to date. But of course, they're obviously very connected, and state legislation can govern local procurement to varying degrees. As we know, in some states, it could be to literally dictate procurement policies, or it could be a state law that requires municipalities to design their own procurement policies. So there's a wide range, again, in terms of the governance landscape. So I want to hand it over to my colleague, Sarah Backer, to provide some background on the first resource that we wanted to share with you today, and that's our toolkit on plant-based proteins. But by way of big picture background, I just want to note that our municipal climate work at ELI, which includes the resources we're going to talk about today, is generally aimed at providing cities with resources that hopefully reduce the transaction costs of taking action on climate. So we do the best practices research. We suggest some options or what we think are state of the art. We provide cities with resources to help them learn more about a topic. I mean, this is not a very different from what ICLEI does, obviously, but because we're lawyers, we're, as you'll see with the second resource we're going to talk about, we're very focused on sort of the legal governance tools. And we always want to provide as much information as we can so that a city can find information about a peer city, because we found that really matters a lot, what your peer cities are doing. And then we provide enough information, hopefully, that cities can kind of tailor their approach to their own circumstances. As we know, every city is different in size and stakeholder group and dynamics, resources, political landscape. There isn't a one size fits all. But I will note that we've been very impressed with the incredible range of staffing and resources among cities, particularly in mid-sized and smaller cities in the middle of the country. I live in Nashville, where Jennifer is, and Jennifer can confirm this, but I think we have something like 7 full-time equivalents working on sustainability, but Seattle, which is not that much bigger at all, has over 40. Right. So there's just a really big difference. And, you know, the toolkits and model policies we're highlighting today, and I will say there are quite a few other models that we have as well, and we'll have a list of those at the end, but they're particularly intended for smaller and mid-sized cities. But we also hope that by diving in and trying to figure out what best practices are, that it's useful to cities that may be more comfortably resourced and want to just go for the gold standard on a given policy, and that the research we've done is helpful. So I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to walk through the background on the plant-based proteins toolkit. A lot of what she's going to talk about isn't related to procurement specifically. It sets the stage, and then we'll circle back to procurement. Sarah?
Thanks, Linda. So as Linda was saying, we know that this group is most interested in the procurement aspects of our resources, but we just want to establish some general background on why we should care about plant-based proteins before diving into the procurement-related measures in our toolkit. So food accounts for an estimated 1/4 of US households' consumption-based emissions, and plant-based proteins contribute the least to protein food-related emissions. So this means that cities and towns can leverage plant-based proteins for climate action while achieving a range of other benefits that we will talk about shortly. And so we focused on 2 aspects specifically. First, we focused on how to make plant-based proteins more available, and we also focused on how to engage the public on the benefits of plant-based proteins. So by way of background, like Linda was mentioning, we like to include a wide range of examples from different cities and towns. So this way, different cities and towns can identify peer cities and best practices from peer cities. So for all our best practice resources, we aim to provide examples from geographically and size diverse groups of municipalities. So we did a lot of research, and we came up with a final list of how to categorize the different actions in our toolkit. So we sorted these actions into 7 categories. And as you'll see, category 3 is all about municipal procurement. It's about increasing the procurement of plant-based proteins by municipalities. And we will note that a lot of our categories overlap in the toolkit. So for instance, category 3 about procurement also has different overlapping actions in, for instance, category 2. So increasing the number of meals served or offers that contain plant-based proteins. And as you see on the slide, the other categories of actions also include public awareness, raising recognition over leaders in the space, and providing incentives, funding, and technical assistance for those who are seeking to expand plant-based protein offerings. So just to give you a sense of how our toolkit is organized, the toolkit is organized in 2 parts. The first part is our long list of 40 actions that include those procurement-related actions that we'll talk about in a second. And then the second part surveys key considerations. So it surveys all of the different benefits of adopting plant-based protein actions, and also challenges to adopting these actions, and spells out different legal and policy considerations, as well as procurement considerations. So our main focus with this was that plant-based protein actions offer huge carbon reduction potential. And since most plant-based proteins have a comparatively small carbon footprint and plants require less in the way of resources and energy to grow, harvest, and distribute. So in addition to this climate mitigation potential, municipal efforts to increase the availability of plant-based proteins and engage the public on their benefits can contribute to a whole range of co-benefits in different areas. So first, these actions can expand consumer choice by providing more options for individuals with specific dietary needs. So for instance, for those with lactose intolerance, they can also improve resilience and food security by diversifying different protein sources. These actions also offer municipalities with a means of addressing growing concerns about the welfare of farmed animals. And they also reduce the environmental impact of the food system by reducing the water footprint and water and air pollutants associated with food. These actions can also promote equity when plant-based protein actions serve to increase access to healthy, affordable, and accessible plant-based proteins to those who lack adequate access. And they also have the potential to provide public health benefits, given that most Americans fail to meet the USDA guidelines, the USDA federal guidelines for suggested amounts of protein from plant-based sources. So that was just a survey of the different benefits of plant-based protein actions. So just to touch a little bit on the challenges of adopting different plant-based protein actions. So if you are really interested in the subject and the substance, I recommend looking at our toolkit so you can read about the cost and potential savings of adopting plant-based protein actions, and you can read about challenges with quantifying emissions reductions and changing behavior. But before we move on, I'd just like to flesh out the cost and potential savings question. So whole food plant-based protein meals, especially when they include beans and rice, tofu, lentils, and quinoa, tend to be inexpensive. And in fact, they tend to be less expensive than comparable options. And there is a growing amount of evidence that municipalities and their institutional partners and local businesses stand to save on food-related costs by increasing the availability of these kinds of plant sources of protein. So New York City, for example, is projected to save $1 million annually from their New York City Health and Hospitals initiatives, where they have instituted plant-based defaults at all 11 hospitals, at all 11 public hospitals. That being said, factoring plant-based meat analogs, so you can think about Beyond Burgers and other plant-based burgers, into this cost conversation can add a little bit of complexity because these alternatives tend to be more expensive than your rice and your beans. That said, industry market research has been suggesting that plant-based products like these are moving towards price parity. And it's important to keep in mind that roughly half of Americans view plant-based foods as more costly than other proteins, but that majorities agree that they would be willing to make the substitutions if these plant-based alternatives were cheaper. So for this reason, when implementing and adopting different plant-based actions, it's important to keep in mind the perception of cost as well as the actual cost. And our toolkit has different actions to provide residents with easy and affordable services and recipes and other resources to show them that they can stand to save money when eating certain types of plant-based proteins. And now, Linda, back to you to talk about the actual procurement actions in the toolkit.
Great. And I just want to make sure everyone saw that we put the link in the chat to the actual tool in case you want to skim through it as we're talking. So we're going to turn now to the actions specifically related to procurement in the toolkit. But as Sarah noted, there are a lot of other buckets or categories as well in the toolkit. So these are primarily taken from actions already underway in other cities for the most part, and we note some examples for each one. So what I'm going to do is just give you an overview, run through these actions, and then we're happy to talk more about any of them in question answer time. So the first action we have is to just simply estimate greenhouse gas emissions from municipal food procurement and to make that data publicly available in order to promote awareness and accountability. And this is the case in DC. They actually have a law that requires the city to do this. The next action is to set targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from municipally procured food. Alyssa alluded to this type of approach in her remarks. So this would be, we're going to reduce municipal emissions from food by X% by 2030, and again, measure and report on progress. The next one, 3A, is more specific to plant-based proteins. So this is establishing targets for increased plant-based procurement. There's so much alliteration for municipal operations, specifically. So it'd be, we're going to increase purchasing of plant-based proteins by X% by 2030, or ensure that at least, Y% of proteins procured are plant-based. And this is an approach that Berkeley, California has taken. We go to the next slide. So this action is more holistic. And again, Alyssa talked about some of these, but this is adopting a broad food and climate purchasing strategy to purchase healthy and low carbon foods, particularly plant-based proteins. Eugene, Oregon has in their climate action plan to buy climate friendly first for food purchasing for public institutions. And then the next one, this is to engage with or partner with an expert organization such as the Good Food Purchasing Program, or to take the Cool Food Pledge to increase plant-based protein procurement across municipal operations. And note, a city can do this, such as New York or DC, but also subunits like a school district could do this, like Cincinnati and Pittsburgh have done. And then if you go, the next one is another way to approach this is simply to update and establish municipal food standards and nutrition guidelines for municipal operations that include requirements, or at least recommendations, for increased plant-based protein procurement. Philadelphia has done this. And then the other actions include things like updating or establishing procurement training, right, for municipal staff to try to build the institutional knowledge and to do trainings that include best practices for increasing plant-based protein procurement. And New York City has done this. So if we go to the next slide, there are also several actions that weren't in the procurement bucket in the toolkit, but obviously have procurement implications. So one of these is to institute weekly menu initiatives like plant-powered Fridays. We try to stay away from meatless Mondays because the research shows that people don't like giving up things. They like getting things like plant power. So this would be a weekly menu initiative for municipal operations. And then a city could encourage what we call semi-autonomous or quasi-governmental entities, such as correctional facilities or public schools, hospitals, convention centers, to do this as well. And we can talk more about these entities if helpful. But as you know, for example, a mayor can't just necessarily direct schools to take a certain action because they typically have a separate elected school board that would have to sign off. But this general approach, a lot of cities have done this, but we have Florida County, and I think we have someone from Florida County on the call today. Another is to require municipal operations and events sponsored by the municipality to offer at least one comparable plant-based protein option. Carver, North Carolina, has this action in their climate action plan. And another is just taking it a whole step further and making plant-based protein meals the default for municipal operations and events sponsored by a municipality. And this obviously would have procurement implications. Now, you're probably familiar with New York City, but they have gone plant default in all of their public hospitals. And it's, by all indicators, been, quite successful. So those are the actions in the toolkit related to procurement. We can stop here and pause, which might make a lot of sense before we dive into Compost procurement policy. But Alyssa, I defer to you.
Yeah, I was going to wait for questions at the end, but let's pause now since we'll transition to a different
because we're
subject.
really switching substantive
Yep,
topics.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
great. Yep,
So
so just open the space for questions, comments from anybody.
and we're really interested in any feedback, when you hear about list of actions, do you go, wow, we could never do any of those, or yeah, there was something in there I think we could do, because that's kind of what we're aiming for, is to just like do a big menu.
I'm just wondering, has there been any cities with procurement policies that offer some type of incentive to the vendors somehow? Like if they reach a certain greenhouse gas emission reduction, like is there a way we can incentivize them some way to encourage them to participate? Because what I hear from departments that do their purchasing, that they're worried that the policy will be so restrictive that they won't be able to get what they need. Because we were already experiencing supply chain issues and such. So just curious.
So that probably goes to a little bit more of a level of detail and expertise in procurement than, we can just give you an example off the top of our heads. But we're going to talk a little bit about this issue on the compost procurement. But I mean, I think the answer is yes. It would take a little looking on our part, and it's a little bit harder sometimes to, get to do research on that, like kind of level of like drafting of bids, et cetera. But it's definitely an approach that we've seen and read about, and we would be happy to follow up with you with some examples, because I think that's a really good point about the supply chain concerns, and just like, are we going to get anyone, right? Are we going to be able to get the product? So I think that's a really fair point, and you'll see it with the compost procurement policy that we drafted. We provided a lot of outs, right? Like, if you couldn't get it at this price, or you couldn't get it locally, like some off ramps essentially. And Sarah, you may want to add something to that, or Jennifer.
Yeah, I'll add that I feel you, Tikora, because in Nashville, as we work to update our contracts to include more sustainability language, we're very much mindful of that. We're like, okay, we can be kind of pie in the sky, what would we ideally want, but we have to be cognizant of what vendors actually exist in the local landscape who can provide these services. And of course, we have to be mindful of, cost and resources and all of that too. So like Linda said, we've tried to kind of walk that line by, providing, like putting in the contract, like these are preferred criteria, but maybe not mandatory, so they could get extra points for it, but it's not a disqualifying thing. And that way we kind of leave our options open, like, well, anyone could qualify, but if somebody's got these extra great things, they're going to get a higher score, and we're going to be able to award to them and go with that vendor. So, but it's definitely a concern to make sure that we have enough kind of qualified vendors in competition. So,
and just to make sure I understood the question, when you said incentives, what were you thinking of? I just want to make sure I understand for our further research purposes.
Yeah, I was just looking for, I don't know if there's a mechanism to even offer some type of incentive. I don't know.
Okay, no,
I can't give you an
I just want
example,
to
but
make
just
sure.
what
Yeah,
would encourage vendors to abide by what
Yeah.
we're trying to implement.
Yeah.
And
no, I really,
because I'll give you an example. Like we're working with our cafeteria to try to request specific items be post-consumer products, a certain percentage. I'm just giving you an example. Now, it may cost them more to use those products versus using the current styrofoam or something. You get what I'm saying? And then if we're requiring it versus, like you said, you softening the language to say a preferred option. So I'm just trying to think.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're asking the exact right question. And to be perfectly honest, I hadn't really thought about it that way. Like I've just, put myself in the position of the, chief sustainability officer, the procurement staff, but I haven't put myself in the position of the supplier to think like, well, what is going to make me step forward and bid on this? So I think it's a great question. Anything else? Or we can,
There seems to be someone with their hand up.
oh,
Yeah.
Ross.
So one thing that I think you could do for something like that is if you do a request for proposal, you'll have a scoring criteria, and then that's where you can put in 5 points, 10 points for sustainability focus, and you could target that at containers or food itself. And then that way you can, you can make it a requirement essentially, because if they want to get those points, they have to do something, whether that's using plant-based, packaging or whatever else. And then it'll give your evaluation team the leeway in the room to get that preferred sense, right? We want you to do this. We're going to reward you by giving you more points if you obey us.
Right.
It sounds kind of bad, but
Great, thank you. Okay, well, I think we can move on then, Linda and Sarah, to
Okay.
the compost procurement.
All right, sounds great. Thanks for those comments. So the compost procurement policy is a little different from the toolkit in that it provides actual language a city can use to implement compost procurement policy. And we have a little screenshot of it just to give you a sense of what it looks like. Now, I do want to tell you that this was our first model policy quite a few years ago. And we realized that having the side bubble approach wasn't going to actually work. It was like a layout nightmare. So now the commentaries are in footnotes on the same page. And we have like a clean version of this with no commentary and then with commentary. But I want you to get a sense that it's a very different type of document. So Sarah, if you can go to the next slide. So compost procurement policies basically require or encourage in some manner that municipalities purchase and use finished compost products in public projects such as landscaping, construction, stormwater management. Think any earth disturbing activity, basically. The next slide, we have several definitions in the policy, and we don't need to spend time on these. I really just included them for your later reference. So we can go to the next one. So by way of background, before I jump into the substance, this policy was developed with Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC. It's a collaborative effort, and we've done several models since then with them that grows out of our food waste reduction work with NRDC. So again, the provisions in the policy are based on extensive research on best practices around the country. And as I noted earlier, this resource, like our others, is designed to be adaptable tool, right? That can be tailored to the needs of individual municipalities. So as I mentioned, we have an off-the-shelf version that if you wanted to, you could just adopt as is. A city council could adopt it, or a mayor could adopt it as a policy, or a department. But then there's also that version with commentaries that we showed that provides background and also alternative approaches on some of the key provisions. We also develop a slide deck for each of our resources. And we did that because we received requests early on, for example, from a small NGO that really wanted to present this policy to their council members. And they needed something that sort of summarized it all. So we now just always do a slide deck that can be used to present the policy. Okay. Next slide. So why adopt a compost procurement policy? So here are some of the economic benefits. I'll get to the environmental benefits in a minute. It can increase demand for compost and therefore increase business for local compost suppliers. It can help divert organic waste to be composted, which in turn can reduce costs associated with landfill disposal. The cost saving issue will depend jurisdiction to jurisdiction, such as, what are tipping fees at the landfill, but it is possible to reduce landfill disposal costs. When you have a policy like this, it helps grow the compost market in a city. So it may result in the development of new compost processing facilities, which in turn may create more jobs. And then, on a more basic level, applying compost increases soil nutrient and water retention, and that in turn may reduce the demand for irrigation and fertilizer and reduce overall operational costs. So, with all of these things, as I'm sure you've talked about a lot, it's just really important to look at the full cost life cycle in making the case for some of these sustainability measures that might even cost more upfront, but at the end of the day, cost less. So the next slide, list some of the environmental benefits, and I'm not going to run through all of them. I'll just highlight a couple, but as you can see, there are a whole lot of environmental reasons you would want to do this. And, you know, as I mentioned, if you're diverting waste from landfill, not only does that have cost benefits, as I mentioned, but you can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions associated with decomposition of organic matter in landfill. As you know, methane emissions are particularly potent greenhouse gases, and it may, you know, ultimately reduce the need for new landfill construction or new incinerators. And as we know, landfills and incinerators are disproportionately sited in low-income communities and communities of color. And again, another one I'll just, you know, flag is that adding compost to soil helps prevent erosion and stabilize land, which may be particularly important as we have more extreme weather events and flooding, for example. Next slide. And we're going to, we sent these slides to Alyssa, so you have them for reference. Okay, so this is the heart of the policy. It's a requirement that the municipality purchase compost for use in public projects. And that is provided that compost is the appropriate material to use, and also that it is not cost prohibitive to acquire. And note that cost prohibitive means that the product purchasing cost exceeds by more than 10% the cost of another product that would serve the same purpose. And I can say more about the cost prohibitive standard and how it could be modified in a minute. The next slide just clarifies, as I said earlier, that this would apply to basically all earth disturbing activities. Go to the next one. So here, this is an issue we flagged a little bit earlier, and we can sort of skip over this slide and go into more detail if people want to talk about this. And this is going to vary from municipality to municipality, both with respect to legal jurisdiction, but also the other factors that are noted on the slide. You know, whether you're just trying to apply this to your departments that are, you know, part of the central municipal authority, or whether you're trying to reach out to private public entities like convention centers or quasi or semi-autonomous entities such as school boards. Go to the next one. I just wanted to note, you know, sort of following up on the point that was raised earlier, there are other approaches a city could take instead of the cost prohibitive standard, and we address these in the commentaries on the policy. So, I mean, for example, you could modify the definition of cost prohibitive to increase or lower the 10% standard. You could also decide to gradually ramp it up over time. You could replace it with a whenever practicable standard, which would allow the municipality to take into account factors in addition to the purchasing cost. And I think this is something Sacramento has done. Another way would be to just require that a percentage of purchases would be allocated to compost, right? And again, that percentage could be ramped up over time. All right, go to the next one. So shifting to other aspects of the policy that might be of interest to this group, the sourcing and quality requirements for the compost that is required to be procured. And I'm going to just flag these issues and happy to talk more about them in Q&A. So this and the next slides cover basically the compost itself, right? Where the procured compost has to come from and what its quality is. So this may be a little bit more into the weeds than that you want to go, but I do want to flag that the standard we put in the policy is to procure locally produced compost that is produced in the same region where it is being used. But if that locally produced compost is not available, the compost must be sourced from outside the region, and with preference given to products sourced as close as possible to the municipality. And I do want to note that the policy requires documentation and reporting on the fact that locally produced compost was not available at the time of purchase, or if it was cost prohibitive. We want to sort of have a record of how this worked or didn't work. If you go to the next slide. And these are just, again, some alternative approaches that a city could take, such as providing exceptions for situations where compost products are not available within a reasonable period of time, right? So there are just some different off-ramps that can address this, you know, problem of, you know what, it was just too hard or impossible, to procure compost. The next slide. Again, the takeaway here is that any old compost won't do. The compost must be purchased from the U.S. Composting Council, STA program certified manufacturers. And again, this is something that we would hope that cities would document and report on, so that we have a sense of whether it's working and how hard it is to find that kind of compost. And some cities go even further on these requirements and required testing data, et cetera. But we try to sort of hit that sweet spot where it's sort of state of the art, but it's not like over the top, because you're always balancing. You don't want it to be so burdensome that nobody wants to do it, right? So we're always trying to sort of figure out what that sweet spot is. All right, the next one, and basically last one, these are some of the suggested reporting requirements that have the Municipal Procurement Office basically reviewing reports from departments, tracking progress, and then sharing that information with the public. The goal basically, is for the tracking and reporting requirements to, first of all, like demonstrate that the city is leading by example. Maybe private sector will follow, and identifying opportunities to improve the sustainable procurement efforts in the city. And then there are annual reporting requirements, such as just tracking the volume of compost purchased throughout the year, the total amount spent on the compost. We also ask for the cities to recommend how to increase the percentage of purchased compost in the future. Like, we don't want it just to be sort of, let's report the numbers, but let's think about this and see if we could do even better, or maybe they're just barriers that need to be addressed. So I think we can wrap it up there. The next slide just has the links to this resource. If you, and then these are links to all of our model policies and ordinances and toolkits to date. And then the last is just how to reach us. And we'd love to hear from you. I know this is like a lot of information. So please, if you think of something later that you should have told us, by all means, reach out. So thank you so much for listening, and hand it back to Alyssa.